this idea that the disease or that, suicide is inside the person, that depression is inside the person and it's a disease. I see that more as like a sort of concession, as like, okay, this person is gonna take this sick role.
I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with the people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more. Kristen Syme is an evolutionary anthropologist working at the VU, Amsterdam. Kristen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
This is going to be a really interesting topic. We talked a little bit before starting this interview about this because it's a topic that really affects so many people. It's quite touchy, and there's a lot of interesting emotions going on here. So you've been looking at suicidal and self-harm behaviors in the context of what is sometimes called bargaining strategies, social bargaining strategies. Obviously, you don't mean it in the sense of kind of conscious manipulation. What we're talking about here is thinking about these behaviors as like an evolved strategy, which means in the sense that hunger is a strategy and fear is a strategy, and all of these kind of quite unconscious emotions and behaviors and cognition is kind of a strategy. And I think this is one of the most interesting hypotheses in evolutionary theory, and it really does shine a light on some behaviors that we are very familiar with on a day-to-day basis amongst kind of teenagers and parents, the conflict that goes on there that's very famous in the culture and we don't really think about from an evolutionary perspective. So yeah, could you just talk a little bit about the kind of background theory here, and especially why humans as well might have kind of uniquely evolved to engage in these behaviors and how we think about them?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that, suicidal behavior or suicide is sort of defined, it's like a manner of death, but most suicidal behavior is actually non-fatal. So when researchers, especially evolutionary theorists, are interested in if there is a function of suicidal behavior, we need to look at the most common sort of behaviors, which are non-fatal suicidal behaviors. And they may actually, at least according to our hypothesis, they exist on a continuum of social withdrawal, ranging from, very low severity, like avoidance or low cost avoidance behaviors. So that's just sort of standard cooperation theory that, direct reciprocity, partner choice. If someone is harming you or the cooperative endeavor is just not working out, well, you can leave that partner, you can switch partners. But what hasn't really been much of a focus in the evolutionary literature at all is powerlessness. The fact that, over the course of our lives, certain individuals, we experience powerlessness relative to others. Other people have more power over us, and we have more power over other individuals. So the bargaining model actually frames suicidal behavior and sort of this social withdrawal continuum, with suicidal behavior being the most extreme, the most high cost form of this social withdrawal, as a means of stopping the cooperative endeavor until the higher power party makes some concessions.
Right. You make an example
with a lower power person.
So you make an example of like labor strikes in your recent paper and kind of withdrawing cooperation and
we know people do this. Yeah.
Proving to people that, that it's rational for you in a situation to say, hey, you're treating me unfairly and I'm being disvalued in some way, and I need to kind of prove to you like my worth, and I need to kind of earn my worth. And one of the ways that we do that is by withholding cooperation, or proving to the other that we will in the future withhold cooperation or kind of disappear as the sort of as the suicide.
I may have better options. There's other people for me to cooperate with, or I'm just going to take my chances and just leave, just move away if I can. However, there are situations where people, because humans need other humans to survive. It's just built into our survival strategy. We cooperate with other humans on everything that's of fitness relevance, cooperative breeding, subsistence. arranging marriages is a communal activity. So just all these things that are of fitness relevance are we do with other humans, and people conflict over them, and people need to have strategies to assert what their own fitness interests,
value to the other individuals, right? I mean, so there is this question that other evolutionary hypotheses have picked up on in suicide, especially Kaz Soper's approach to the pain and brain model. But and one of the main pieces of evidence he cites is that animals don't seem to engage in these behaviors, and that it's a very specifically human thing. And you talk about this as well, about self-harm and suicidal behaviors and these kind of self-injurious behaviors really being quite human specific. But your explanation, which I really like, is that actually it's because humans are so interdependent, we're so cooperative, people really value each other and need each other to kind of be at their best, helping each other. And we obviously also engage in much more like medical and healthcare kind of behavior and than any other species. So yeah, we're kind of entwined. We're leading this cooperative life, especially in the context of children and sort of young adults, which is where we see this real spike in this sort of behavior.
Because they're powerless,
right,
compared to others. They not only have less authority culturally or socially, but they're just physically smaller much of the time. They don't have the same sort of status, social networks of other authority figures. They're not in league with the elders like parents often are in these small scale societies. So yeah, they're more likely to have to resort to these high cost withholding cooperation strategies.
And especially
when women too.
Right. Yeah. So women and men both have these slightly different challenges, especially when they reach adolescence, when men are off kind of status seeking and trying to earn their place in a group, and and they do risk taking that sort of another form, often going off into the wilderness, like Vision Quest sort of thing, or warfare, warfare being very risky. And obviously, I think in very much it's a similar context to suicidal behavior. You must do this because your fitness depends on it, kind of thing. Because the alternative is there is no alternative. Right. Yeah. I mean, it really it sheds a sort of light on these probably one of the most common conflicts in families today, which is just the child sort of getting their way, trying to get their way, and the parent trying to get the child to help them. I think that, especially one of the most interesting aspects of this is that it does take into account this whole wide range of behaviors, and you're not just concentrating on suicide. Suicide is this very costly extreme, which in one of your papers you actually point out that the suicide itself, there's an inclusive fitness benefit. You compare the inclusive fitness benefit model and the bargaining hypothesis, and you point out that the idea of actually wanting to commit suicide to kind of improve the welfare of your family doesn't really hold up. But
it doesn't hold up. Where we see it in these Arctic populations, these look like cultural adaptations. So there's other people involved. So when you say in some of these societies, like in Siberia, if you say, okay, and it's generally older people, if you say I want to die, well, they're going to be held to it. And so it's really like a suicide homicide kind of situation.
Wow. God.
So it's not even, it's related, but maybe it's even a little, we need to talk about something else there, a different model there.
Right. Yeah, I think this is something that happens in evolutionary psychiatry a lot, which is that the disorder or the thing that everyone's concentrating on is the extreme end of the spectrum. It's the actual schizophrenic who is completely unable to do anything or work or live, and they're never able to connect with reality. But then you also have this huge spectrum of the schizotypal spectrum behind it, which we know is genetically related, and many of the behaviors and the cognitive features are very similar. But we're sort of in a conundrum just trying to explain the extreme thing without thinking about all of the behaviors below that, which seem much more obviously sort of normal within this normal range, and they're things we expect from everyday life, things we expect from teenagers or people who are being subjugated to some sort of oppression or being devalued. Yeah. So yeah, I wonder for the parent who is hearing this and who is in a difficult situation with their child, like what is the response, right? How do we affect like our public health responses, or even just on a family level? Like how what do we say to them about this reaction?
Yeah, I mean, so it's not about saying like, okay, powerful people are to blame. I want to be very cautious about that. Um, it's that it's power asymmetry and it's conflict. It's also private information. So there is something that the more powerful person doesn't know. For instance, how much does it mean to this person? Uh, so one example is that of sexual assault. So if a woman is not believed she is being sexually assaulted, it could be, I hate this example, but it's a common
Yeah.
example of a stepfather. That's an obvious
Right.
conflict of interest there. Does
Mm.
the mother believe her daughter, or maybe she thinks her daughter has some other reason to lie about it because maybe she's not getting as much attention, or maybe there's step siblings.
Mm.
So and also I want to say it's tough to talk about these examples because these examples are so they resonate so much with Westerners. So sometimes when we see examples, maybe that just don't really occur to most of us, like forced marriages.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to see the power dynamic. You can kind of take a step back and say, okay, I can see, I can see what's going on here. Like, I'm not
Right.
really taking sides. I don't feel implicated in it at all. So yeah, when we're talking about things that occur in our own society, it's difficult. But I mean, I think the clinical model, um, this idea that the disease or that, suicide is inside the person, that depression is inside the person, and it's a disease. Um, I mean, I see
Mm.
that more as like a sort of concession, as like, okay, this person is gonna take this sick role. They're gonna, as a way to like maybe gain concessions,
Oh,
maybe gain
interesting.
investment
Right.
from the family. There's numerous examples of this across diverse societies. So like spirit possession cults function in this sort of way. That you sort of, it's a concession, in East Africa, especially in Islamic societies, women who become spirit possessed, but women and men, it's usually women in conflict with their husbands, and it's low status men who become spirit possessed, the very people you might expect to be depressed and suicidal. And so what they do, they take on the sick role. There are ceremonies involved. There are even there's the trance state, the possession state itself, where the persons can sort of release the anger, the anguish, and it's in full public view of whoever is important. And
Mm.
the husband, if it's say a woman's in conflict with her husband because he's going to take a second wife, which women tend not to like all over the world, even where polygyny is common. Um, the husband has to pay for the ceremony. He has to appease the spirit by buying perfumes and like sweets. And so it doesn't resolve the conflict in the sick person's favor, but they do gain benefits. And I see when I see sort of the sick role with depression and suicidal behavior functioning in a similar way. I, you know, I don't want to speak about every case, but it's really about acknowledging, um, acknowledging the fact that we're all interdependent with each other. So if someone is suffering, they're it's not in a vacuum.
Right.
There is something that they want that usually other people may be able to provide, um, that others aren't giving to them. An example that came from my research with Chon Chuuk, which we'll talk about more in a few minutes, was a young man. He wanted to go to a particular university, but his father wanted him to stay locally to help take care of a sick family member. Um, the son didn't want to do that though, but he had to. So he was sort of
Mm.
really discouraged about this. Then after the family member passed away, his father wanted him to do other things for him. So it just didn't stop there. He never got to go to the university he wanted to.
Mm.
And he said of himself at that time, like he was just so discouraged. He said very emphatically, I was depressed.
Right.
And there was nothing he could do to change his father's mind. They got into a public fight at the admissions office of a local community college. But the father
Jesus.
had the father had a lot of authority.
Mm.
So he like congregated the family for prayer, in which he sort of reasserted his authority in the situation, and that people need to, check their hearts, whatever, people say in those kind of situations. And yeah, he said he was depressed. I don't know if he was clinically depressed. I didn't, make that kind of assessment, but that's,
how did it resolve in the end?
Eventually he just was able, his father loosened his grip and he was able to do other things. And also these conflicts just resolved because they're just not of the essence anymore. So, okay, you didn't get to go to the university you wanted to, but, you move forward and then circumstances change, other opportunities arise.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's incredibly complicated and touchy to think about. What's the right thing to do here? And you've mentioned this sick role and like the fact that we see these things as sicknesses and I think you make a really interesting point, which is that we in saying that, we are sort of excusing the person from responsibility for the state that they're in. You're saying, okay, this is some like socially recognized difficult situation, difficult state, biological, psychological, social state that you're in, and we are somewhat justified as a society to try and help you, and which is sort of a reverse on some of the criticisms you hear of saying like depression is a sickness or suicidality is a sickness, because one of the criticisms is that, oh no, this is caused by social forces, and actually you're trying to put the blame, and some people see it as kind of blaming the person for their state. But I think that the evolutionary approach really kind of lends something in that you recognize that there are these social forces and that those are really the precipitators of the state. But then also say that, okay, but it's still, it's still a biological state that's out of their control and that's kind of leading to all of these harmful behaviors and conditions. And it's also something that you can perhaps potentially like alleviate through some social means, right? And maybe in some case you need medicine to help get through that period or whatever. But and
I think that's interesting about the personal responsibility, because one thing you see in a lot of like healing ceremonies that many so speaking of Czar cult, that like I.M. Lewis, who wrote the famous anthropologist who wrote about Czar cult, another sort of the expert on spirit possession, he directly tied spirit possession or many instances of spirit possession to depression. British anthropologist Carolyn Humphrey, working with Duar shamans in Inner Mongolia, many of the patients were there for what she called depression or soul loss, which looks very much like depression. And what happens in these ceremonies is very often that either the patient themselves or the shaman enters a trance state. So, for instance, the Czar cult, the women, or the women or the men, they're expressing something, but they're not, they're in this altered state of consciousness. So, for whatever reason, it seems to be very important to the therapeutic encounter across these very diverse societies that don't have like a recent cultural history.
Right. It's so interesting. And it also seems like something that's kind of missing from a lot of our medical interventions, right? You never have this.
And how do you bring back spirit possession, man? Because the Enlightenment, man, we like lost something there.
I know, I do. I think I talked with Nikhil Chowdhury a little bit about this, that having these public healing rituals, and where everyone kind of gathers around, and it really does show social support, right? And you never really get that in modern society. You go to a doctor's office, you get a diagnosis, and then you can kind of talk about.
You may tell someone, you may not tell someone.
Exactly, right. And there's also no emphasis on getting family members to turn up and kind of bear the cost of the ritual to kind of show that they really care.
Universal. Yeah.
Right. And it's like
so the person, like with the men or with the Duar shamans, provide an interesting example. So say there's like a young woman, so this is sort of an archetypal case. A young woman has experiencing soul loss or depression, and she is the focal point of the ceremony. And in the background, the shaman is telling a story. It's a myth. So it gets into this like authoritative symbolism in the society. The shaman tells a myth. A shaman can be a man or a woman in the society. Maybe, for example, about a young woman who was in conflict with her uncles, maybe very similar to what the young woman is experiencing. And in this myth, the young woman becomes pregnant before getting married. She was so scorned by her uncles, she turned into a bird and flew away. And so that story is being told in the context of this power asymmetry and conflict of the patient who is present, the uncles, the elders, so the elders, and they pay for it. They very often pay for it. Now, I don't know if that resolves the conflict. So that could be another example of the patient is gaining concessions, but maybe not winning the conflict per se.
Right. But I mean, it's certainly, whatever it is, it's very different to what we do now. And there does seem to be something psychological there that maybe does just convince someone that, you know, people are there for them, and also kind of reiterate to the uncles in this case that, you know, that they're at danger of losing their niece because she might fly away. And yeah, it's yeah, I mean, I honestly wonder, I think one of the first sentences in one of your papers is, sorry, I forget which one, I've read them all today, is that like suicide is a bigger problem than homicide and war combined. And this is just such a huge problem. And it's something that none of the interventions have ever really been able to move the needle on. You know, the figures are just getting worse and worse every day, every year. It seems like, you know, a deep understanding of exactly what's going on and like the psychological mechanisms that are driving people into this place, and also the social forces which kind of push them there, and then also maybe, you know, the social forces which can pull them out, or maybe provide some hope or relief. It seems
we haven't even resolved the homelessness problem, which I see in many ways as sort of a continuum of like this, you know, there are people who are just, they can't make it in society, and they're just on the streets.
Yeah.
And a lot of these people, like the same people who are at risk of homelessness, they've experienced sort of childhood traumas. You know, there's a lot of overlap in those risk factors. And nobody is helping them. And so you know, I'm not trying to be like dark here, but I think we need to be honest about the fact that, is there someone there to help people who are suicidal, like genuinely help them? Because if, like, you know, in some of the examples I'll talk about, the individuals who were suicidal in the face of family conflict had other family members they could go to.
Right.
But what if those people just don't exist? So that's when we're really talking about like a social issue that we really need to collectively, as a society, deal with.
Right. And it's something that's hugely different to anything that was ever, you know, evolutionarily relevant, right? We're so disconnected and set up in this very strange society. So on that note, I think this is really interesting, and I will leave that conversation for the next episode, which people can listen to. So thank you for this talk, and I look forward to chatting to you soon.
Thanks a lot, Adam.